Taho ki Pumihia Tēnei Whariwānanga, Otago University. So my name is Olivia Yates, and I'm a PhD candidate based at the University of Auckland. I myself have British ancestry and am Palangi, but I stand here today in this sort of messy researcher activist space as a supporter of Pacific communities on the front line, including those that I work with closely. So right now is a very important time for many Pacific communities. This Saturday, our Prime Minister is going to be making a formal apology for the dawn raids. When announcing this apology, Minister Aotearoa said, "I am hopeful that the apology will affirm New Zealand as a country where every person, irrespective of their colour, gender, sexual orientation, or religious beliefs, should be treated with dignity and respect." Yet, in the context of climate change, our immigration and climate change response is not treating frontline Pacific communities with that same dignity and respect. We've talked a lot today about health systems and the interdependencies of all of the other systems. So today is just another example of how all of these things connect. I'm going to be outlining the role of dignity in climate migration, and then I'll talk about the well-being consequences of an undignified immigration system. For a bit of background, so many frontline communities in the Pacific and their leaders are needing to develop policies to respond to the severity of climate change impacts. For low-lying Pacific atoll nations like Tuvalu and Kiribati, there are few options for internal migration out of harm's way, so they're looking to develop alternate climate solutions. For the nation of Kiribati and its former president Aotearoa, shown in the image there, they developed this migration with dignity framework. The purpose of this is to provide vocational training for Kiribati to migrate within existing pathways to neighbouring states. This was developed as a consequence of legal gaps. In other words, there are essentially no protection for people who migrate for climate-related reasons. So-called climate refugees do not exist. They are not protected within international refugee law. So this climate refugee term is actually resisted because of its implications of vulnerability and lack of agency, and dignity is much more preferred. However, Kiribati has now shifted towards adaptation as their focus, recognising that many Kiribati do not want to leave their ancestral homes. This means that for those who do wish to migrate, for whatever the reason, they must do so on an individual basis through existing channels. When we think about Aotearoa New Zealand, we already have large and vibrant communities of Kiribati and of Tuvaluans. So this image shows the Nganumangan community from Tuvalu at Pacifica Festival earlier this year. For people from Tuvalu and from Kiribati who wish to migrate to Aotearoa, and I note that it's for a complex range of reasons, not only because of climate change, they must also do so within existing migration channels. Here we have similar legal gaps as in Kiribati as around the world, except here our focus or our response to climate migration tends to retain sort of dominant focus on securitizing our borders, on preventing people from coming, rather than reflecting our justice-based obligations towards our Pacific neighbours. So given that Aotearoa is likely to be a future host for people who migrate from the Pacific for climate-related reasons, it's important to understand the well-being consequences of navigating these immigration systems. In order to answer this, we've developed a collaborative action research project which seeks sort of climate mobility justice, working alongside the Tuvaluan and Kiribati communities in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, where I'm currently studying. This project is based upon the Talanoa research methodology, which foregrounds Pacific ways of doing and being. So I'm going to share with you just a snapshot of our findings that come from 8 different Talanoa group sessions held last year, which we managed to squish around a series of COVID lockdowns. Yeah. I note that the communities did have really diverse responses to climate change, but there were shared threads throughout that, so I'll speak to some of that. So our first shared thread is this concept of navigating immigration obstacles. This can take quite a toll on Pacific communities and create a lot of stress. So Emily outlines that here, being New Zealand, 15-minute break is 15 minutes, not 15 minutes and 1 second. Yeah, and we call it the Palangi time, eh? But we don't have a choice. We have to obey and abide by those because we don't want to lose our jobs or get in trouble. And we ask to see the manager, and we can't really explain why we are a bit slack. Maybe we are sick or unwell, but we have to, work hard, no matter what. So in Emily's example, we see the stress that can come from precarious employment, from trying to adjust to different cultural practices, and from working within the constraints of a work visa, in which employers often have little grace for sickness or for different cultural understandings. As a consequence, many Kiribati can face exploitation in the workplace because their right to remain in New Zealand, and from that ability to support their family, access healthcare, access education, all relies upon keeping their jobs no matter what. So thus we sort of see how Aotearoa was tending towards a capitalisation of our immigration system, wherein migrants' bodies are translated into commodities rather than as people worthy of dignity and respect. You can sort of see echoes of the dawn raids in this as well, which reminds us again, when we think about Minister Opioto's statement, that we really do hope that people would be treated with dignity and respect. But dignity needs to be in more than just employment. So Charles then says, we want to see a migration where our cultures are preserved and supported as part of our identity and value, as part of being in New Zealand. And this is the next of those shared threads. This concept of regrowing roots is so critical that Kiribati, that Tuvaluans, that future climate migrants have a space where their language, culture, and identity can be supported. The purpose of this goes beyond just wanting to have a space, but actually it can provide healing. So Emily later went on to say that for her, living in community way really helps us to, be Kiribati. We have our own programs, like we dance, we host, just sitting together, we don't talk, we feel, like relief and healed, and but mainly the language and the practices, like dancing and proper etiquette. So despite experiencing adversity, having a space where you can practice culture, engage with community, and speak language is really, really important and can be a source of strength as well as well-being. Therefore, what does this mean for our immigration response and, as a consequence, our healthcare response to climate migration? Well, it's an opportunity for us to move towards dignity. Aotearoa is finally responding to the injustice of the past, of the dawn raids, but we're not adequately responding to the injustice of the present, of climate change and of climate-related migration. This gives us an opportunity to reinsert dignity into our migration response, and that can look like providing support for employment or housing, alleviating the stress and the burden of navigating those immigration obstacles. And it can also be an opportunity to support the strengths that the communities already have by resourcing them for language, culture, and identity. This resourcing is not essential for communities to know that they have dignity. The image shown is of the Bunabun community from Kiribati up in Auckland, celebrating the anniversary of their ancestors' arrival in Fiji over 75 years ago. And they do this every year without government support. But providing that support says to people who migrate that we see you, that we value you, and that we support the continuation of your culture for future generations. The imperative to do this extends beyond just human rights, but into our justice-based obligations towards the Pacific. To finish with Nui's quote, this is important because it's important to highlight that, we're the ones being impacted, but we're not the cause. And I would like to hope that if the time comes, like our people are welcomed by the likes of New Zealand or Australia or other countries, and they treat it like they have their dignity. So with that, I'd like to say a huge whawhetai to all of those who've contributed to this research and to you all for listening today. Kia ora.